My husband finally cut ties with his toxic mom and sister after they demanded we give up our house for my jobless sister-in-law and her family. There was a time when I thought life with Jacob, my loving husband, would be picture perfect, but I was so wrong. Not because of Jacob, who has always been everything I could ask for, but because of his family, a web of toxicity that reached out like a snake, trying to choke the joy from our lives. I didn't just marry Jacob, I married his family too. And that's where everything started to unravel. From day one, it was clear that his mother and sister had an odd dynamic with him. A sort of possessiveness that grew more disturbing as time went on. Jacob was always the golden child, and his mother adored him like no other. Growing up, his father was constantly away for work, leaving his mother and him alone most of the time. This made their bond unbreakable, or so it seemed. On the surface, it might have looked like a beautiful family connection, but it came with its own dark side. His younger sister, Sarah, grew up in the shadow of this overwhelming favoritism, and it left her feeling neglected. She craved attention, and unfortunately, it manifested in the most unhealthy of ways, by lashing out at me and trying to keep her brother all to herself. One of the first red flags came when I started staying over at Jacob's parents' house during the early days of our relationship. He was fresh out of college, still living at home, and they had given him his own private level of the house. I thought it was a kind gesture, but Sarah took it upon herself to make it clear that I was not welcome. She would barge into the room, sometimes when Jacob and I were still in bed, without so much as knocking. The first time it happened, I thought it was an accident, siblings forgetting boundaries, right? But the second, third, and fourth times made me realize this was no accident. She seemed to thrive on the discomfort she caused, especially when she found us in compromising positions. I tried to rationalize it, maybe she just missed her brother, but there was something unsettling about the way she would ignore my presence entirely, acting like I was invisible while addressing only Jacob. Finally, I put my foot down. I told Jacob that I wasn't going to come over anymore unless he installed a lock on his door. He agreed, understanding my discomfort, but as soon as that lock went up, Sarah's true colors showed even more vibrantly. She threw a fit, yelling and hammering at the door, demanding that Jacob let her in. When he finally opened the door, her face contorted in anger, and she called me a skank right there, in front of her brother. Jacob defended me, but it was clear that Sarah saw me as nothing more than a threat to her relationship with her brother. Things escalated after Jacob proposed to me. I was overjoyed, thinking that I was about to become a part of his family. But that joy was quickly shattered. His mother and sister were horrified at the news. They reached out to me directly, telling me that Jacob was making a huge mistake, and that I needed to break off the engagement. They said I wasn't good enough for him, that he deserved someone with more status. I couldn't believe the audacity. These were the people who were supposed to become my new family, and they were actively trying to break us apart. Jacob stood by me, and despite their disapproval, we moved forward with the wedding plans. His mother reluctantly offered to help cover some of the costs, but we declined, wanting to make sure our wedding was entirely ours, free from any strings she might want to pull. Instead, we agreed to let her organize the rehearsal dinner, hoping it would make her feel included. It was a mistake. The rehearsal dinner was a disaster. It felt like she had intentionally sabotaged it, setting up picnic tables with cheap plastic covers and serving takeout Mexican food. It wasn't about the money or the decorations, it was about the message. She wanted to show us that she didn't approve, and she wanted everyone else to know it too. Sarah, on the other hand, took her resentment to another level. Shortly before the wedding, she invited herself to dinner with Jacob and me. At first, I thought maybe she was extending an olive branch, trying to reconcile before the big day. I couldn't have been more wrong. Midway through dinner, she accused me of cheating on Jacob, showing him pictures she had taken of me and a coworker, Zach. The photos were innocent enough, just two coworkers chatting outside the office, but Sarah twisted them into something sinister. She claimed she had been investigating me, trying to protect her brother. I was furious, not just because of the false accusations, but because she had been following me, stalking me like some private investigator. Jacob, to his credit, immediately stood up for me. He told Sarah that her behavior was unacceptable, that she was crossing a line. I could see the pain in his eyes. He wanted to believe the best about his sister, but even he couldn't deny how far she had gone. I threatened to take legal action against her for stalking, and that seemed to scare her off. At least for a while. She backed down, reluctantly agreeing to stay away from me. Our wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. But the cloud of his mother and sister loomed over us. The night before, after the disastrous rehearsal dinner, I had had enough. I told Jacob that if he didn't uninvite them, there would be no wedding. I knew it was harsh, but I couldn't risk them ruining our day. Thankfully, Jacob agreed. He called his father, who promised to keep them away. It was the right decision. Later, I found out that Sarah had planned to wear white to the wedding and had even tried to convince other female relatives to do the same. It was a calculated move to hurt me, to overshadow me on my own wedding day. Despite everything, our wedding was beautiful. Without the toxic presence of his mother and sister, we were able to truly enjoy our day, surrounded by people who loved and supported us. It was the first time in a long time that I felt like we were free from their influence. But, of course, it wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. After the wedding, Jacob and I worked hard to build our life together. We saved diligently and eventually bought our first home, a beautiful place that we were both incredibly proud of. It was our sanctuary, a place where we could start fresh, away from the negativity of his family. Or so we thought. One day, out of the blue, I received a call from Jacob's mother. She started with pleasantries, asking how I was doing, how life was in the new house. I was immediately suspicious. We hadn't spoken since the wedding, and her sudden interest felt anything but genuine. Then she dropped the bombshell. Sarah was pregnant again, and she wanted Jacob and me to give up our house so that Sarah and her family could move in. I was stunned. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. She spoke as if it was a done deal, as if Jacob had already agreed to it. I told her that there was no way we were giving up our home, that it was ours, and we had worked hard for it. She became angry, saying that as the daughter-in-law, it was my duty to help the family, that I was being selfish. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The audacity of it all, to demand that we give up our home. Our dream, for Sarah and her unemployed partner, who had done nothing but make our lives miserable. When Jacob came home, I told him everything. He was just as shocked as I was. He hadn't agreed to anything, his mother had lied. He called her, confronting her about the lie. And for the first time, he truly stood up to her. He told her that we were done, that we were no longer going to tolerate her manipulation and lies. He cut ties with both her and Sarah that day, and I could see the weight lift off his shoulders as he did it. It wasn't easy for him, they were his family, after all, but he knew it was the right thing to do. In the weeks that followed, Jacob and I finally found peace. We installed cameras around our home, just in case, and sure enough, one day, his mother and sister showed up, banging on the door, demanding to be let in. I refused, telling them that they were trespassing and that I would call the police if they didn't leave. Jacob arrived shortly after, and together, we stood our ground. They left, defeated, and I knew then that we had finally broken free. The experience taught me so much about the importance of boundaries, about standing up for myself and for my relationship. Toxic people will always try to take and take, but it's up to us to say no, to protect what we have worked so hard to build. Jacob and I have moved on from the pain his family caused us. We've built a life filled with love and respect, and we're stronger for everything we've been through. Jacob and I are still growing, still learning, but we've come out of this stronger than ever. Our story isn't just about the hardships, it's about overcoming them. About choosing each other every single day despite the obstacles. And that, to me, is what true love is all about. My fiancé asked for an open relationship just weeks before our wedding. IATA for canceling the wedding? It was supposed to be a joyous time in their lives, a moment when everything would fall perfectly into place. The invitations were sent, the suits and dresses chosen, and everyone was ready for the day when two lives would become one. But the reality, as it often does, had other plans. This is the story of how a love that once seemed unbreakable became the ground for betrayal, loss, and ultimately, the price of forgiveness. It all began just 2 weeks before the wedding. Everything was perfect, or so it seemed. The groom, let's call him David, was deeply in love with his fiancée, Mayla. They were the ideal couple, the envy of friends, the pride of both families. David thought he knew Mayla better than anyone. After all, they had been together for 9 years, 5 of which were spent planning a life together. However, everything changed on that fateful day when Mela asked David to accompany her to a therapy session. She told him she wanted them to be completely honest with each other before taking the final step toward marriage. Though David found this request unusual, he trusted her and agreed to attend. David had no idea what awaited him. When he walked into the therapist's office, Mela was already there, sitting on the couch with a slightly nervous smile. The therapist was a friendly woman who introduced herself briefly and seemed to be there to help. David thought it was just going to be a routine conversation about their future together, something to reinforce their bond. But as the therapist began to speak about modern relationships and non-traditional lifestyles, David started to feel uneasy. The topic quickly shifted, and Mela began expressing her desire for an open relationship after they were married. David's heart sank. He could not understand what was happening. Mela, the woman who he thought he knew so well, was now asking for something he could never imagine. She wanted to be with other men, but she was clear that she didn't want David to have the same freedom. It would break her heart if he did. The irony of it all was not lost on David. He sat silently as they both explained the idea, the therapist seemingly supportive of Mela's wishes. David could hear his heartbeat in his ears. It felt like an out-of-body experience, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. After a few moments, David had heard enough. He calmly asked the therapist if she was licensed and, receiving confirmation, told her and Mela that the wedding was off and they were no longer a couple. Without another word, David left the office. In that moment, everything he had believed about his future was shattered. He went home, sat on his bed, and listened to the recording he had made of the session. He still couldn't believe it was real. He knew he had to cancel everything, inform his family and friends, and somehow find a way to move forward. The weeks that followed were difficult. David's parents and family wanted answers, and so did Mela's. The story quickly spread among friends, and Mela tried to reach out, apologizing and saying that she was willing to do whatever it took to fix things. But David was not interested. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and heartbroken. It wasn't just about the idea of an open relationship, it was about trust. How could he trust someone who had kept such a significant part of herself hidden until the last moment? David sought legal advice and decided to report the therapist, feeling that there had been professional misconduct. He wasn't sure if it would lead anywhere, but it gave him a sense of control in a situation where he felt he had none. Surprisingly, other former patients of the therapist came forward with similar complaints, and a case was built against her. The clinic responded quickly, and it seemed that the therapist faced consequences for her actions. It was a small victory for David, but it did little to heal the wound left by Mela's betrayal. One day, David's parents invited him over for dinner, saying they had something important to discuss. When he arrived, he was surprised to see Mela and her parents there as well. Mela had brought a journal with her, something she had been writing in for the past year. She claimed it would explain everything, that it would help David understand why she had acted the way she did. David was hesitant, but eventually agreed to take the journal home. He flipped through it briefly, noticing the worn pages and the ink that had clearly aged over time. It was real, not something she had put together last minute to manipulate him. But David wasn't sure if he wanted to read it. What could it possibly say that would change what had happened? Over the next few weeks, David learned more about what had been going on in Mela's life. She had been under immense stress at work, had suffered a miscarriage that she never told him about, and had been influenced by friends who were in open relationships themselves. One friend in particular had planted the idea in her head that David would never be satisfied with just one woman, that he would eventually cheat on her if she didn't give him the freedom to explore. Mela had also recently learned about her father's infidelity, something that had shaken her belief in the stability of relationships. All of these factors, combined with the therapist's encouragement, had led her to make the request that ultimately ended their engagement. David found himself at a crossroads. He still loved Mela, despite everything that had happened. He could see that she was genuinely remorseful, that she had been caught in a spiral of fear and bad advice. But could he ever trust her again? Could they ever go back to the way things were before? Mela was willing to do anything to prove herself to David. She quit her job, started seeing a new therapist, and even offered David full access to her devices and finances. She wanted to rebuild the trust that had been broken, no matter how long it took. Eventually, David agreed to give their relationship another chance. They decided to take things slowly, to start over as friends. They even went on the trip to France that they had planned for their honeymoon, using it as an opportunity to reconnect without the pressure of a relationship. It was during this trip that David realized that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward. France was beautiful, and being away from everything gave them the space they needed to talk openly and honestly. They laughed, they cried, and they shared their fears and hopes for the future. When they returned, David and Mela were not the same couple they had been before. They were different, older, wiser, and perhaps a little more cautious. They knew that rebuilding trust would take time, that there would be days when the past would resurface and make things difficult. But they also knew that they still loved each other, and that was worth fighting for. They made new plans for their future. Simpler ones. They would have a small wedding with just their immediate family. They would get a dog and a cat. And they would focus on being there for each other, without the pressure of trying to live up to anyone else's expectations. This story is not just about a broken engagement or the idea of an open relationship. It's about trust, forgiveness, and the complexities of human relationships. It's about how fear can lead us to make decisions that hurt the people we love. And how sometimes, despite the pain, love can still find a way to survive. One important lesson from David and Mela's story is the importance of open communication. If Mela had shared her fears and insecurities with David earlier, if they had faced those challenges together instead of letting them fester, things might have been different. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, it takes a lot of work to rebuild it. But as David and Mela showed, it is possible if both people are willing to put in the effort. Another lesson is about the influence of others. The people we surround ourselves with can have a profound impact on our thoughts and actions. Mela allowed her friends and even her therapist to influence her perception of her relationship with David, leading her to make a decision that almost destroyed everything. It's important to be mindful of who we take advice from and to remember that no one knows our relationship better than we do. Finally, this story is about forgiveness, not just forgiving someone else, but also forgiving ourselves. Mela had to forgive herself for the mistakes she made, and David had to let go of his anger and pain in order to move forward. Forgiveness is not easy, and it doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means choosing to let go of the resentment and to focus on what matters most: love, growth, and the future. David and Mela's story may not be the fairy tale ending that many people hope for, but it's real, it's messy, it's complicated, and it's full of ups and downs. And sometimes, that's what love is: a journey through the good and the bad, the joy and the pain, and ultimately, the choice to keep moving forward together.